Okay. Good evening, everybody. I think we will go ahead and get started here. We are right at the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tanner Curl. I'm the Executive Director of MinnPost. We're a nonprofit independent newsroom serving the state of Minnesota with in-depth coverage of civic and cultural news here in our state. We really appreciate you being here with us. I mentioned earlier, but do hope you all are staying safe and healthy and right now warm. I'm in my very cold basement office, but I have a space heater on. I've got my cardigan on. I hope you have ways of staying warm yourself. Want to thank you for joining us. Tonight we'll be talking about redistricting and a preview of the legislative session with MinnPost reporters Peter Callaghan and Walker Orenstein. And I'll be handing it over to moderator, our editor, Andy Putz, here in just a minute. But first, I want to say thank you to a number of people. First and foremost, I want to say thank you to our generous members, particularly off the heels of our year-end member drive, which is always our biggest drive of the year. We saw just record amounts of support over the past year, which has been absolutely crucial to the work that we do. We're very fortunate to get support from a variety of sources, but individual donors, members are collectively the biggest source of support for our work, and it comes in at all levels. So we really appreciate it. So thank you to our members. If you're not a member, you can rectify that and head over to minnpost.com/support and make a donation of any amount. Truly, any amount makes a difference. It all adds up. We have people who support our work at all levels, and it all is important and really crucial to what we do. So minnpost.com/support. I also want to thank our series sponsors, Great River Energy, who's been a longtime sponsor of this event and some other work that MinnPost does. I want to thank them for their support. I also want to thank our very long time supporter for this event, RBC Wealth Management and Darla Cashin. Darla, are you here? I don't believe Darla is here, but I want to thank Darla for her support. Again, thanks to our members in Great River Energy as well. With that, I believe I can hand it over to our editor, Andy Putz, who will be moderating the conversation and the event from here onward. Andy, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Tanner. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight, or rather staying in, actually. First, we're gonna. I want to do a little bit of housekeeping here by welcoming a new member of the MinnPost staff. Harry Colbert Jr. is our new managing editor, and I hope all of you will give him a warm welcome. Harry, you want to wave and maybe just say hello?
Hello. No, good evening, and I'm excited to be a part of the MinnPost staff. The last time I was on a call that was similar to this was the festival of last year, and I recognize some of the same faces, and it is a wonderful opportunity to see everyone again, and I look forward to hearing from you throughout my tenure at MinnPost, and I'm truly, truly honored and humbled.
Thanks, Harry. And with that, let's kick off tonight's programming. So we're going to take on two rather big topics, each of which we could probably talk about for days, but we're going to talk about redistricting and the 2022 legislative session. So just the way I think we want to work this tonight, we're going to have Walker Orenstein give us a sort of high-level overview of the upcoming session, and then we're going to have Peter Callaghan give us kind of a status update on redistricting, and then we're just going to jump right in with questions, because knowing you all and the crowds who tend to show up for this particular session of the MinnPost Social, our legislative previews, we know you guys have much better questions than I do. So we will get to them as soon as possible. So with that, Walker, I'm going to turn to you and to talk about the upcoming legislative session. You're muted.
All right, there we go. It
There
said
you
the
go.
host had to unmute me. Sorry about that. I'll blame it on the host. Thank you all for being here. It's great to be here. Session starts on Monday, if you can believe that, January 31st. And just so you know, I mostly cover greater Minnesota issues at the legislature, but I've also covered a lot of public safety policy, police reform, that sort of stuff. At the Capitol, environmental issues, all that sort of stuff. But I wanted to just give sort of a quick overview of kind of what we're looking at headed into session. We've got a divided legislature still. House is majority Democrats, Senate is majority Republican. There's an election year coming up in 2022, as you know, later this year, where the House and the Senate and the governor's office all are up for elections. So it should really influence the dynamics of the legislative session this year. Both parties are sort of trying to set themselves up well for the fall election. To add on to that, there's a huge unprecedented surplus, really, $7.7 billion that lawmakers can spend. It's not a budgeting year, so they set the 2-year budget last year, so they can spend this money. They don't have to spend this money. Traditionally, it's sort of like a bonding year. So capital construction projects, roads and bridges, and asset preservation, like repairs to University of Minnesota buildings, things like that. So that even though it's kind of what they might consider to be a short year, usually it's going to be a lot packed into there. And I would just say, like, for now, in the last couple of weeks, House Democrats and Governor Walz have been releasing a flurry of legislation and plans, mostly spending plans so far, that sort of detail the priorities for the upcoming session. Republicans are slated to start that really tomorrow, though they've talked about public safety stuff as well. But really, there's just so much money on the table and a lot of ideas for how to spend it. House Democrats unveiled a $1 billion climate and energy bill, $100 million for public safety. Governor Walz has released a plan for $700 million in direct payments that he calls Walz checks, which is sort of an allusion to the old Jesse checks with Jesse Ventura back in the day. Spending a lot of money to replenish our unemployment insurance trust funds, plans like that. And like I said, Senate Republicans, they have yet to really detail exactly what they want to do, though. They've talked about Senate Majority Leader Jeremy Miller, who's Republican from Winona, has talked about permanent, ongoing, targeted tax relief. So they're pretty into that concept. But before we can sort of get to all of that machinations over how they'll actually spend that money, in the meantime, there's just going to be a ton of policy debates. The House will pass its priorities. The Senate will pass its priorities. We're talking about fights over schools and school boards, election integrity, voter ID issues, abortion, vaccines and vaccine requirements, climate and energy. And for me, one of the biggest ones I'll be following is policing and public safety. And I thought I might detail that a little bit more later if somebody has specific questions. But really, Republicans have been hammering Democrats for rises in violent crimes like carjackings and robberies, murder in the Twin Cities. And they've been going after the Hennepin and Ramsey County prosecutors for what they see as letting repeat offenders off easily. Governor Walz's Sentencing Guidelines Commission, they feel like are going too lenient on offenders, things like that. And they are wanting more money for police recruiting, cops in general. Democrats definitely have their own plans for public safety, targeting carjackings. And, they had this $100 million plan that talks about community policing and $22 million for crime investigation, things like that. Nonprofits that aim to sort of disrupt violence and other things. So that's going to be a huge issue. And I'll just note that over the last couple of years, policing has really been a top of mind issue at the legislature. There's obviously been the sort of broader debate over defunding the police that, in the legislature has been a big topic in elections, but not really actually at the legislature because House Democrats haven't quite proposed that. But certainly police reform has also been a huge topic at the legislature. And I think that sort of this year will probably take a back seat in terms of both the agenda of House Democrats and Senate Republicans. So it'll be mostly focused on sort of addressing crime. So anyway, that's a long-winded thing, but that's to say there'll be a ton going on. Peter can get into some of this stuff more, and also on redistricting. So there you go. There'll be a million issues.
Well, Andy, since he asked, he said Peter will get into some other things. I just want to throw a little bit more in on the budget numbers, just to sort of demonstrate how much money this is. To start with, because of federal funds last spring, and because the tax economy recovered so quickly, the state had a lot of money to spend in the current budget. And after the session that ended in June, they were talking about that these were record-setting amounts of money in education. Just about everybody got a little bit, if not a lot, of what they wanted and have always wanted. This was a very generous budget to start with. So how much is $7.7 billion? It's so much that we round it down from the actual number of $7.75 billion. 50 million is now budget dust in that place. So I'm relying on my friend Mark Haveman, who I see is on the call, so I'm going to try to quote you accurately, Mark, from the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence. And Mark went back and looked at the history of surpluses. And what we've kind of been used to in years when there's been a surplus is, Mark says, ranging from 880 million to 1.65 billion. 880 million to 1.65 billion. That's what we generally talk about. And those kind of surpluses cause you to do this or that, to do spending or tax cuts or save it. There's so much money in this surplus, you don't have to do this or that. You can do this and that over there, and that thing that you've always dreamed of, but you never had enough money for. By percentage of spending, if you throw in the $1 billion in still unspent federal ARPA money, that has no restrictions, it is 17% of anticipated revenues for this budget. And that's more than the closest other year, which was 1999, if I can read that accurately without my reading glasses. So it's so much money. And then the final thing is, almost always when we've had these surpluses in the past, when they've looked out into the next biennium and the biennium after that, it shows a deficit. If you keep spending how much you're spending right now, and this is how much money we think we're going to collect, they've talked about a structural deficit. This time, the out budgets are actually in a surplus. So it actually gives you the ability, if you want to, whether the R's want to or not, to pass things that are ongoing spending, because you will have money in the upcoming biennia to cover the costs. So you'll hear a lot of talk about, do we do this with one-time expenditures? Do we give Walls checks? Do we give some other one-time money? Or do we do ongoing changes in budgeting? Do we increase the education formula? Do we increase spending on special ed and things like that then obligate you in future biennia? That's what you'll, I think, start hearing a lot about, sort of this one time. Do we just kind of spend it and not obligate ourselves to future biennia? Or do we do the opposite and as the D's say, invest, and the R's say, spend? I just want to give a reminder here to folks to put questions in the chat. Some of you have already taken advantage of that. But as we go along, as these guys talk about stuff, really put your stuff in there. That's we found the easiest way to get to what you want to know and what you want to hear, and then we can kind of try and tick through all that stuff and get to as many of those as we possibly can. Peter, do you want to talk about redistricting? Just give us again kind of a status report, and then we can kind of roll through people's questions.
Sure. And again, I see Representative Murphy on the call and Peter Watson on the call, both of whom know more about this than I do, but I get to talk. So that's what makes this so special. So you have this thing that happens every 10 years called the census, and that obligates governments to rebalance their districts by population. So these are obligations that they have, and they will are in the midst of doing that. And constitutionally, it's a legislative duty to do that. And the legislature has convened special committees in the House and the Senate to look at that and come up with maps. But the politics is such that, and by coincidence, every 10 years when this has been going on for 50 and 60 years, depending on whether it's congressional or legislative, there's been divided government. And you're unlikely to do new lines that satisfy either both parties because you're trying to get advantage. So the courts have done that. And for the last several cycles, someone has sued very early on, even before the legislature has had a chance to fail. And that's what happened this time. And Peter Watson was the main plaintiffs. There are now 3 other interveners appearing before a special panel of this that the state Supreme Court appointed of district and appeals court judges. They had their own hearings across the state. They heard testimony and argument from the 4 plaintiffs. They looked at a lot of pages of briefs. And as we sit here, they're somewhere squirreled away drawing maps because they need to be prepared to push the button on February 15th, which is the state statutory deadline for the legislature to act. And as soon as it becomes clear that they will not be able to reach a bipartisan agreement, that panel and the court will push out these plans. So that will happen February 15th. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I started talking. Let's get to some questions. Peter, Bruce had a question about inflation. How much, is there any sense of how much will inflation eat up the budget money and the surplus?
Yeah, see, this is another example of why sort of the previous conversation about budget surpluses is not as meaningful. That it's between $1 billion and $1.6 billion is the Minnesota Management and Budget's estimate of what inflationary increases from the previous budget would be. And again, that used to eat up the surplus if you in fact did that. If you assumed that every agency should get an inflationary increase, which isn't necessarily the case, but if you were to assume that, you go, see, we really don't have a surplus. I remember the Speaker Hortman in past sessions would go, I need to chill y'all because you think we got a bunch of money, but we don't because of inflation and because of the structural deficits in future biennials. So we really don't have enough much money. As you can see, even if it's 1.6, that's a relatively small portion of 7.75 billion. So it's an issue that's out there. They're aware of it, but because of the size of this, it's sort of not as much a part of the conversation.
I want to get to a question from Jeff, who asked, do you think they will get to the not held special session stuff early? If people remember, right, we were promised special session after special session, which never happened over the past year, dealing with a whole variety of issues. Peter and Walker, what is your sense of that? And are they going to sort of tackle that early? Are they going to tackle it at all?
I'll just start about what I kind of know about the drought relief. So I know one thing that could have been brought up in a special legislative session would have been drought relief for farmers, because last year was pretty dry, and it's specifically like livestock farmers. I will say, I guess I don't know exactly how it will go. It's hard to predict. Things get caught up into negotiations as it did. That's the reason we didn't have a special session in the first place, was issues get tied together. There was, Senate Republicans wanted to potentially fire MDH Commissioner Jan Malcolm, and Governor Wallace didn't want that to happen, so we didn't have a special session. But I will say, in terms of the drought relief, that's a pretty bipartisan issue when it comes to the specifics of the drought relief money. I'm sure that they could find something to disagree with each other about, but that issue never really was, like the frontline worker pay. There was differences and is differences in plans for how to spend it. But in terms of drought relief, there's never been a huge gap between the parties on that particular issue. But Peter can talk more to the other stuff.
Well, the governor asked that be the first thing that they do, particularly the drought relief and the heroes checks. They don't do anything right away. A couple of years ago, they all said that authorizing the Secretary of State to spend the Help America Vote Act money, around $6 million, was a good issue because it was an easy win, and it would give them practice in getting along and finding bipartisanship. And that lasted till the end of that session, if not special session, because it got tied up in fights between Mary Kiffmeyer and Steve Simon and other arguments. So I'm skeptical about them talking about early action and easy wins. We learned over the summer and fall that gridlock and disagreement is so intense that they can't agree to give away other people's money, which was the $250 million set aside for hero checks. So those will be issues. You would think R's and D's could all get together for farmers, but because it was tied up in the hero check issue and the Jan Malcolm appointment issue, nothing stands alone.
I'm going to paraphrase Sandra's question here and ask about tax cuts. There's $7.7 billion. Any chance that they're going to send any of that back to people? And what would that potentially look like?
Walker, you want to go?
You got this one.
Okay. Yes, I think they both will talk about some tax cuts or tax expenditures, depending on your party. And so the weird thing about the Walz checks was not that he wants to give them, but that he actually named them Walz checks. See, I wasn't here at the time. I don't know if Jesse Ventura called them Jesse checks or if other people started calling them Jesse checks. Had the governor just said, I want to do rebates, people would have started calling them Walz checks without him doing that himself. It was kind of weird.
Isn't it a bit like giving yourself a nickname?
Yeah. So people who give themselves a nickname are forever nicknamed nickname. So nickname Walz wants to do that. He's also talking, and I think we might hear about that tomorrow, about some actual ongoing tax cuts. The Republicans will also hear from tomorrow. I think we'll do more intense tax cuts. I had a question from someone saying, will the Republicans actually propose new spending? Yeah, I think they will. I think they'll, hire cops and maybe do some other spending programs, but they will definitely, I think, tomorrow come out with tax cuts. It's awfully attractive in an election year to do that. It's also when your surplus is that large, it's kind of hard not to do a little bit of both some spending and some tax cuts.
Yeah, I'm curious from both of you. So this is a question from me, just because I know both of you not only have covered the Minnesota Legislature for multiple sessions, but you've also covered other states. And so I'm wondering, the size of that, the surplus, Does that make things easier or harder, or is this so unprecedented that it's impossible to tell?
Peter and I were just talking about this before he left the office earlier, and I'm pulling up a quote here, but I was just trying to remember back in covering Washington State days, and I feel like it'd be like, oh my gosh, we've got $200 million to spend, and isn't that going to be great? I will say so far there's been kind of a mix at the Capitol on whether that makes things easier or if that makes things difficult, with an election year coming up. And all that money, there's a lot to disagree with about. But I talked to State Representative Paul Marquardt, who's from the Moorhead suburbs, and he's actually retiring after the 2022 session. He's not running for election. And he, he's the tax committee chairman, so he's got some interesting kind of views on this. And here's what he said, which I thought was interesting. There's been a lot of people who said it actually makes it harder. There's just a lot more people to fight about, a lot more things to fight about. But he said, there's redistricting, which already makes legislators a little more skittish because you're going to have a new district. So you want to kind of bring some things home. I'm paraphrasing here. But he said, you've got a governor's race where Walz wants to get some stuff done. In the Republican majority in the Senate, you've got two senators, Paul Gazelka and Michelle Benson, who are running for governor, and they want to sort of have some accomplishments that they can check off. And so he said, I think it's in everyone's best interest to get something done in the end. So he also called himself, said he still has naive optimism. So maybe, I don't know, maybe that's naive optimism or maybe it's the truth, but that was his sort of outlook. And he's been at the Capitol for decades. So I thought that was kind of an interesting take that I figured I'd share.
Well, it's a truism that more damage is done to budgets in surpluses than in deficits. I think there's some truth to that because you do run the risk of committing yourself to spending that isn't sustainable in normal times, let alone in a bad economic time. But it's every state's problem this year. Every state has this same phenomena where the economy went down very quickly in the spring and summer of 2020 because of the COVID recession. It stormed back very quickly. It turns out if you spend $6 billion, like the federal government has done over the three major COVID relief bills, it actually has an effect on the economy. And but it sort of depends on the size of the state. Noted that Minnesota's surplus is larger than Vermont's budget, and California's surplus is larger than Minnesota's budget. So in California, their surplus is something like $48 billion. So it's everybody's problem right now. And somehow the feds thought last March and April they needed to send $350 billion out to the states who were in real need of help. And then they said that most of it, a lot of it can be called revenue replacement for revenue that they lost during the recession. And as it turns out, they really didn't lose revenue over the course of the budget period. So I think the states are worried that the feds might want to try to claw it back. And they're reluctant to leave a lot of it sitting around as proof that they maybe didn't need it. But at the same time, the Fed says you don't need to spend it this year. I mean, the state's unspent ARPA money is really programmed for half of it to be spent in the next budget period, which doesn't start until July of 23. So they can park some of that away for a while. Yeah, you can make mistakes.
I'm skipping around, I realize, but you know what? That's my prerogative. I want to ask about commissioners. Somebody brought this up. Is there any sense that that's going to be? Are we going to see more of what happened with the GOP targeting some of Walz's commissioners in this session? Walker, I'm going to look at you.
I heard they're going after the ag commissioner.
was gonna say, certainly possible, any commissioner. No, the Ag Commissioner, Tom Peterson, they seem to quite like, so that's probably not gonna happen. Yeah, I can't read the future on that one. I mean, it certainly held up session with Jan Malcolm for long enough that seems like an obvious possibility. A lot of the subject areas that I cover, environmental subject areas in particular, those commissioners have already been fired or resigned. Steve Kelly, who was rejected from the Department of Commerce a while back, and then Laura Bishop at MPCA, she left. I was trying to think, I know right now that Senate Republicans are not thrilled with the corrections commissioner. In general, just policy from the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. Now, I'm not trying to spread rumors. I haven't heard anything personally about, that being a possibility of him being removed. In fact, I can't necessarily remember. It's possible he was already confirmed, but that there are obviously still frustrations with commissioners on behalf of the Republican-led Senate. So that's definitely a possibility. And I saw Peter shaking his head, so maybe I was wrong about Paul Schnell possibly being confirmed. But
I'm just saying he's not been confirmed.
Right. So yes, I can't say for certain, but that seems like it's always a theme, and especially in an election year. Though, we've got a new Senate Majority Leader, so it's possible that there's a bit of a different tactics. Who knows? You're muted, Peter.
Yeah, I know. So tea leaf reading. Senator Benson was not one of the leading critics of Jan Malcolm. She has the committee, the Health, Finance, and Policy Committee that would have committee domain over that appointment. She has been expressed concerns and she has asked a lot of questions, but there was no real sense that she would lead a charge to remove Commissioner Malcolm. A month ago, Benson announced she is giving up that chair position and it's going to Senator Utke instead. She's running for governor, she's busy, maybe she doesn't want that much work and pressure, or it could be that the caucus wanted to take a harder stand on Malcolm and she didn't want to do it. Today, the housing commissioner announced that they have set Friday at 9 p.m. as the deadline for applications for rental assistance. That's a bit sooner than anybody thought, and it's also a very short turnaround. It's in 2 days, 3 days from now. And there was some concern about the quick announcement that they think they don't have enough money for anyone who applies after Friday night. Rich Draheim, who is the chair of the Housing Committee that has a portfolio over that appointment, and Commissioner Ho was put on notice last June. She was one of the people that they had mentioned. And today, the statement from Draheim is, from a shaky rollout to this abrupt closure, Commissioner Ho has mismanaged rent help every step of the way. That does not sound like a committee chair who's going to not have some conversation about that appointment.
Another question from the chat here. I'm actually going to pair two questions here. So I don't know, Walker or Peter, if you guys want to, you can both jump in on this. But the Mariam's question, considering is there any money earmarked right now for Minnesota's diverse communities of color and all other different minorities with disabilities, mental health, trauma, behavioral health concerns to fill in the gaps that exist? And to piggyback on this, Nick asked, are there any specifics on the community equity piece of the House DFL bonding proposal? I don't know if which one of you or either or both of you want to take that, but.
We're both walls, and we haven't got a lot of detail on the House DFL capital spending bonding bill. Have set aside parts of their spending that they put into the equity category. The social service and the education budgets have a lot of money for a lot of things, including some of the items that you mentioned. We learned today from the House DFL that they're not just going to spend $7.75 billion in their rollouts this week. We were trying to do the math and we realized that things were going beyond that. And the speaker told us today that, well, the things that we put dollar amounts on, like the $1 billion climate action proposal, those will all fit within the $7.75 billion. But we're also mentioning a lot of other things that we think would be good. And that's what the legislature's for, to cull these things down. So I thought that was an interesting thing, that they're not restricting themselves in their announcements of spending programs to 7.75 billion, even though they know that's kind of the high water mark, because the February forecast will not, it'll drop that surplus down, I'm pretty sure. So I was chastised by the speaker for calling this a wish list today, but they are kind of building just kind of everything that every committee chair would like to do over and above whether it's affordable within the surplus.
Walker, do you want anything?
I'll just chime in to say, I also don't know necessarily about the details of the equity stuff in the bonding. I remember there being money for that in the House bonding proposal, I believe last year. And, you know, I guess I can't remember if anything got into there, you know, some of that stuff falls into categories that don't actually need a vote, a supermajority vote in the House and Senate. There's a lot of sort of complicated stuff. But from what I remember, Senator Bach was not too thrilled about kind of expanding the bonding bill to include that sort of stuff over in the Senate. From what I remember him saying so far this year, he was talking about wanting to do projects that were, you know, state owned. So things that go towards, say, a nonprofit that helps communities of color may not necessarily be in his wheelhouse. So, you know, just to keep in mind. So we might not have details about that, but that might not have much traction in the Senate anyhow.
Walker, I just want to, while you're talking, I mean, one of the things you mentioned early on in your sort of overviews, you talked about, you know, some of the writing you did on public safety issues and sort of last year compared to sort of kind of where things left off last year and what you're hearing this year. I think it might be helpful for you to go a little bit deeper into that sort of, you know, sort of where things were left off, what didn't get done, and then how that conversation has changed.
Well, in the last couple of years, the legislature passed a lot of policing legislation, most of it aimed at sort of like police accountability is the phrase that's usually used at the Capitol, you know, limiting the use of no-knock warrants or restricting the use of no-knock warrants, for example, banning some, you know, police departments funding warrior training, you know, some stuff having to do with low-level warrant reform, stuff like that. You know, the legislature really went into detail on a lot of that, and Democrats wanted a lot more. And I wanted to throw out one thing that they really fought for last year, which was, you know, limiting traffic stops for what they considered low-level infractions, like a broken taillight or an air freshener in the rearview mirror, that kind of thing. And they framed it, you know, Dante Wright got pulled over initially for having an air freshener. And they said these kinds of stops disproportionately happen to Black Minnesotans and can sometimes lead to, you know, people being killed by police. And I will say that that has taken a pretty sharp turn in this legislative session. I have not heard for calls for that sort of legislation. In fact, Republicans have been really frustrated with, you know, say Ramsey County Prosecutor John Choi for, you know, not prosecuting some felony cases that stem from low-level traffic stops, for instance. They've been defending those types of traffic stops. So that just shows you sort of how, you know, this has gone. And I will say it's not that Senate Republicans were necessarily a fan of the proposal, but seemed like for a quick minute, they were considering it. And there were some Republicans who, we're kind of open to the concept. And I just don't know that that's the case this year. And so, Senator Paul Gazelka, who was the majority leader at the time, said he doesn't necessarily, he doesn't regret any of the legislation that they passed previously, except for maybe some of the changes to when police can use deadly force, because that got caught up in sort of a lawsuit. And that was passed pretty quickly and had some issues with it. But he said they kind of want to focus on going the other direction this particular year, tougher sentencing, more money for police, limits on discretion of prosecutors in who they charge and what they go after, those sorts of issues. So I'll say it feels like the conversation has taken a pretty sharp turn. And there's been a rise in some in violent crimes. And so that's probably to be expected. And it's not limited to just the Republican Party. Democrats have also proposed a lot of legislation on that. Things like trying to expand a state investigative unit that usually does insurance fraud to help with things like carjackings is just one example. And I talked about some of the money earlier, help for other sorts of investigations and body-worn cameras and things like that. So a very, very different debate at the Capitol this year in terms of public safety. And yeah, I just don't know some of those other things that Democrats had pushed for, whether they'll be returned to in a significant manner this year. And I will say Democrats haven't really come to the legislature so far and really touted those as, hey, we're so close last year, we really want to get this over the finish line. They've instead sort of pivoted to some of these other public safety measures. So yeah, different conversation.
And Andy, maybe this is a good time to insert. There was a question in the chat about how Minnesota election issues will dovetail with national issues. Can you dovetail completely? All of the same themes that are going on nationally are going on in this campaign. The Republicans have found some vulnerable points. They are crime and they are schooling in COVID, with the sidelight of the, obviously trumped up, I don't mean that as a pun, issues of critical race theory and whether or not school boards, Biden, or even the National School Board Association said that parents should be parents are domestic terrorists. That is being hit very hard by the gubernatorial, both of those issues are being hit very hard by the gubernatorial candidates in this state. They're being hit very hard nationally. They were tested by Youngkin in Virginia to great effect for the Republicans. And what they think the beauty of these issues is that they're suburban issues. And suburbs is where they lost the legislature or at least the House 4 years ago and 2 years ago. And it's where they need to get it back if they're going to get the majority back. So the issues are really almost identical. There's a playbook is a national playbook on these issues.
I'm curious for you guys, kind of, Peter, just working off what you were talking about in terms of nationalizing these elections and the Star Tribune recently did a pretty fascinating story, I thought, about Crow Wing County and the level to which disinformation had kind of seeped down to politics, even at a local level. I'm curious, have you guys seen at the legislative level that affect what people talk about, how they talk about it, or is that more of something that's going to be more apparent as the sort of campaign stuff heats up?
Walker.
You take it, Peter.
Hey, it's a greater Minnesota question.
I guess I will say, as candidates running for governor have all been asked this, specifically on elections. And usually, if I remember correctly, like Paul Gazelka usually says something to the effect of, I am certain that Biden won Minnesota, and I can't really comment on the rest of the country. So there's some sort of tightrope walking with that, but there is still sort of a Republicans really want to talk about election integrity issues and voter ID and things like that. And that sort of conversation usually springs out of some of this talk about elections being rigged, some false talk about that sort of stuff. So I can't necessarily attribute that to every single Republican or every single election integrity bill, but certainly that filters into the conversation at the Capitol and amongst those running for governor. So yeah, this definitely comes up here, if you can remember some better examples, but that's sort of what came to my mind was Senator Kozałko's response to that question.
Yeah, I mean, the difference in the gubernatorial candidates is the candidates who are pretty much all in on COVID response complaints and the school things, and that would be Neil Shaw and Scott Jensen. And then there's Benson and Kozałko, who have to sound like they think those are legitimate issues. So they say things like, Benson says things like, parental control of education is vital. And parents and school boards and schools need to be partners with parents. Well, that's a way of communicating to certain voters in that Republican endorsement process that you're with them or sympathetic on those issues. You say, there are questions that need to be asked about the election. There are legitimate questions, and just asking legitimate questions shouldn't label you as a conspiracy theorist. Things like that. Walker said tightrope, at least for those two candidates who consider themselves, I think, to have the potential of crossing over and getting independent votes. They don't want to sound too there, but they need to sound there enough to not just get crushed in a endorsement process that comes down to 2,000 Republicans in the state, and they tend to be the 2,000 most active Republicans in the state.
We're getting quite a few questions here about redistricting, so let's kind of turn to that. Peter, I think in the chat somebody talked about some of the maps that have been proposed. Do you want to just there's obviously these parties involved in this lawsuit. Do you want to just sort of, you've written quite a bit about this. Do you want to kind of characterize the sort of proposed maps that have been put out there so far?
Yes, sir. If someone can put those last two stories I wrote on this that have some maps in them, that would be great if you could put those in the chat. So there are 4 interveners, and I'm sure the 4 interveners don't like being labeled, but they're labelable sort of in this way. There is the Republican interveners, which is the Anderson plaintiffs, the Sachs interveners, which are the DFL plaintiffs. Peter Watson, Joe Mansky et al. Are the people who have been involved in elections and people who have been involved in past redistricting processes who think that this should be nonpartisan. And then there's the Corey plaintiffs that organized exclusively to increase the voting cloud and the representative cloud of communities of color. So those are your 4. And they presented maps and arguments for their maps to the panel. But the panel is not going to pick one of the 4. The panel is going to take all that into consideration based on what they also determined were their principles, which I've also are linked to in those stories, as to what a plan must encompass. So, I mean, obviously a principle is got to have the same number of people in them. A principle is you can't unreasonably dilute the power of voters of color, communities of color. And you can't also pack them. You can't turn around and create, well, I created this majority minority district and it's 98% minority residents, because now you've packed so many of those people into one district, when as before you might have been able to put them in 3 different districts. And instead of having 3 what's called minority opportunity districts, you have 1 minority majority district. So the courts, those are all US Supreme Court rulings that will come into play. They wanted the tribes to be kept together as much as possible. So there are principles like that they will, that they have said by order will be driving the decisions. And the 4 interveners and plaintiffs all said, well, my plan did that. My plan did that really good. And you should look at my plan for these reasons. So it's hard to look at. And then interestingly, the House and the Senate have produced their own maps. And I'm not sure that the court really looks at those. They're not plaintiffs in this litigation. They didn't sue. They have the opportunity to succeed if Representative Murphy and Senator Johnson can somehow come to a deal that divvies up the pie in ways that both sides could agree to. I think that's very unlikely. Then these maps that come out will be fresh, and there'll be something we've never seen before. There's another concept that's of interest is, do they do a least change map? The court's not really supposed to, and the US Supreme Court, as Peter Watson has told me repeatedly, is not inclined to let state court redistricting go nuts. There was a time when they reduced the number of districts. They said, we got too many legislators. We're going to reduce the number of districts. And that was turned away by federal courts. So will they do least change, just enough to kind of make the numbers balance? Or will they do something more aggressively to pursue and satisfy these other principles? And the Corey plaintiffs said, you really need to be aggressive here. If you're really going to let these new districts reflect the population changes of the state and the increased diversity of the state, you can't just do least change. You have to do something more aggressive. And those are, I think, the issues that will come out. But it's interesting because everybody will be sitting there on February 15th, hitting refresh all day, waiting for those maps to be posted.
Well, somebody else mentioned too, I mean, the political process, for selecting, precinct caucuses and the DFL that happens next week. How do we have a political process when people don't know where the lines are going to be drawn?
These caucuses will be based on the existing legal precincts. Once the precinct caucus system ends at midnight or whenever on Tuesday, we won't use those precincts again, but those will be the precincts that will have determined the party's delegates going forward. So, interesting question, but it's what you would really be worried about is if you were going to have an election, because everybody failed and the election's coming up. The reason February 15th is magic is because it counts back from filing day in May. And they wanted to provide, by statute, they wanted to provide enough calendar real estate for campaigns to know what district they're in, move if they have to, and start a campaign. That's what February 15th is. It's counting back from filing day. And it's why you do have the courts involved and why you do have a deadline, because you don't want the legislature to fail and continue to fail. And suddenly it's primary election day. And you've got a bunch of people running in what are unconstitutional districts because they're not population balanced.
Does the redistricting stuff affect the session in terms of what people do and how people do it? Or, Peter, you've covered this stuff before where people have been trying to legislate in the middle of a redistricting process. How does that change things at all? Or how does it change things?
Well, it heightens the politics and the political pressure of the session. There's a real good reason why you're seeing a lot of retirements
Yeah.
Because people, there's two reasons. One, particularly on the Democratic side, there are longtime incumbents who are getting primaried mostly on a generational basis. And the other is, it's like, this is a good time to get out, because I don't know what that district's going to look like. I don't know how I'm going to move around. I don't know if I'm going to still be in it. And remember, everybody ran 2 years ago. This is the one time when senators don't get a 4-year term. They're not used to that. They're not used to having to work that hard. So they all have to run again, and that's why you're getting the resignations. And it will, suddenly imagine those maps come out on February 15th, and Representative Putz and Representative Callaghan are suddenly in the same district. And we both want to run. That's not going to affect how we deal with the session. I mean, it really will drastically increase the press conference quota, because then that suddenly puts those people in the position of having to, call attention to themselves. What might have been a safe seat for them before is suddenly a contested seat within their party, perhaps, or even outside. I mean, they talk about pairings and how these maps, how many pairings are created. There was a congressional map, I think it was the Corey map, that had 2, if not 3 members of Congress, Republican members of Congress in the same district. What complete coincidence, I'm sure. So it can't help but ratchet up the politics of the session.
For the record, I would retire and run for county commissioner if I had to run against Representative Callaghan. So, listen, I know we didn't get to a bunch of questions, and there was a lot of really good ones in there that we didn't get to, but I do want to be mindful of time. And I also just want to thank Peter and Walker for their time, not only for doing this tonight, but also just for the time and dedication they have to covering the legislature and bringing you all, the great journalism that they do. Tanner, was there anything else that you wanted to say before we wrap up for the evening besides thank you?
Yeah, just gratitude again to Peter and Walker, and to our moderator, Andy Putz, intrepid MinnPost editor as well. A welcome to Harry Colbert Jr. as our managing editor, and thank you to all of you for joining us here this evening. Thanks to Great River Energy and RBC Wealth Management, Darla Cashin, for their support for this series, and our thanks to our members. Peter put his email address in the chat if you want to email him with any questions you had. That accessible MinnPost reporter as always. But yeah, I think we'll wrap up. And Walker added his email to the chat too. Didn't want to be left out. So yeah, thank you again to them for sharing their insights, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Have a good night.
Thank you all.